Today we're recapping Season 7, Episode 12, of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, Hot Pursuit. The team takes to the skies above the triangle in a helicopter, chasing down the source of UAPs hovering over the property. And what happens next turns a bold investigation into a terrifying encounter nobody on board was prepared for. There are episodes of this show that stay with you because of what gets discovered. And then there are episodes that stay with you because of what gets felt. Episodes where the investigation crosses a threshold that data alone can't fully capture, where the human beings at the center of this story are confronted with something that pushes past the boundaries of what instruments can measure, and land somewhere much more immediate and personal. Hot Pursuit is that second kind of episode, and it earns that distinction through one of the most intense sequences this investigation has ever put on screen. To understand what makes this episode hit so hard, you have to start with the decision itself. Taking a helicopter into the airspace above the triangle is not a casual operational choice. The triangle has been the most consistently active and most instrumentally disruptive zone on the property across multiple seasons. Drones have malfunctioned in that airspace. Sensors have returned readings that defied straightforward explanation. The space above it has produced some of the most compelling and difficult-to-desist UAP documentation the investigation has generated. Going up there in a manned aircraft, specifically to chase down whatever has been hovering in that zone, is the kind of decision that reflects both genuine courage and a deep understanding of what this team is potentially walking into. The setup for this episode carries a particular kind of tension. There's a quality to the preparation that goes beyond the usual operational focus. A quiet intensity in how everyone moves and communicates. A careful attention to detail that signals this is being treated as something significantly different from a routine instrument deployment. The helicopter represents a capability the investigation hasn't fully used in this way before. It offers speed, altitude, and maneuverability that ground-based operations simply cannot match. But it also puts human beings directly into the airspace that has been responsible for some of the most extreme anomalous readings on the property. That trade-off is clearly understood by everyone involved, and the episode doesn't try to minimize it. The risk is real, and the show lets that reality sit in the room without softening it. When the pursuit actually begins, the energy shifts immediately. There's something fundamentally different about watching this investigation from the ground and watching it from the air. The triangle looks different from above. The geography that has framed so much of the investigation's work comes into view in a new way, and the sense of scale that context provides makes the objects being pursued feel more real and more significant than they sometimes do when observed from a distance through a camera on the ground. Whatever is hovering above the triangle in this episode is not a distant smear of light on a long-lens camera feed. It's something the team is actively closing distance on. Something that exists in the same physical space as the aircraft. And that proximity changes everything about how the encounter registers. The pursuit itself unfolds with the kind of momentum that makes it genuinely difficult to look away. As the helicopter closes in on the UAP activity above the triangle, the data being gathered in real time starts painting a picture that doesn't match any simple, conventional explanation. The objects being tracked behave in ways that challenge what should be possible given the atmospheric conditions and the physical parameters of anything the team could identify as a known aircraft or natural phenomenon. That behavioral strangeness is not new to this investigation. It has been documented repeatedly across multiple seasons, but experiencing it from inside a moving aircraft, at altitude, with the triangle directly below, adds a dimension to it that ground-based observations simply cannot replicate. Then the encounter shifts in a way nobody anticipated. What began as the team pursuing a phenomenon transitions into something that feels considerably less comfortable. A moment where the dynamic between investigator and investigated seems to reverse itself in ways that are hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. The people on board the helicopter go from feeling like they are chasing something to feeling, very suddenly, like they are the ones being engaged. That transition doesn't happen gradually. It happens fast, and the reaction it produces in the team is not the measured, analytical response of people reviewing data after the fact. It's the raw, immediate reaction of human beings confronted with something genuinely alarming in real time. What specifically happens during this encounter, and what the team experiences as a result, sits at the heart of why Hot Pursuit lands with the impact it does. The show handles this sequence with a restraint that actually makes it more effective. Rather than overwhelming the viewer with dramatic music and rapid-fire editing, it lets the team's reactions and the raw footage speak for themselves. And what they say is significant. The people inside that helicopter are not easily rattled. They have spent years on this property encountering things that would have sent most people running. The fact that what happens in this episode shakes them as visibly and as genuinely as it does tells you something important about the nature of what they encountered. There is also something worth sitting with about what this episode represents in the broader context of how this investigation has evolved. For years, the approach to UAP activity above the triangle has been primarily observational, watching, recording, analyzing from a distance. That approach has produced evidence worth taking seriously, but it has also kept the investigation in a fundamentally passive relationship with the phenomena it's studying. You can learn a great deal by watching something from afar, but there are questions that observation from a distance simply cannot answer. Hot Pursuit represents the most direct attempt this investigation has ever made to close that distance, to move from watching to actively engaging. And the encounter that results from that attempt makes very clear that direct engagement with whatever is operating above the triangle is not a neutral act. The aftermath of the helicopter encounter is handled with the same honesty that makes the encounter itself so effective. Nobody tries to immediately rationalize what happened into something manageable. There's no rush to fit the experience into a pre-existing framework that would make it easier to process. Instead, the team sits with what they've just been through and allows the full weight of it to register before starting to analyze. That willingness to let an experience be what it is before trying to explain it away is part of what has always distinguished the best episodes of this show from the less effective ones. And Hot Pursuit demonstrates it at a moment when the stakes of doing so are as high as they've ever been. From a purely investigative standpoint, the data gathered during this operation is significant in its own right. Having instrumentation in the air, close to the phenomena being studied, rather than on the ground trying to infer information from a distance, produces a qualitatively different kind of evidence. The readings captured during this pursuit add important material to the body of documentation the investigation has been building around UAP activity above the triangle. And some of what those readings show is going to require serious analysis before its full implications become clear. But the data, as important as it is, ends up being almost secondary to the direct human experience of this encounter, which is itself a form of evidence that this investigation takes seriously and documents carefully. It's also worth noting how Hot Pursuit fits into the arc of Season 7 as a whole. This has been a season defined by a more aggressive, proactive approach to investigation, by a team willing to take calculated risks in pursuit of answers that passive observation cannot provide. The rocket launches of Episode 8, the unexpected discovery at an overlooked area of the property in Episode 9, the historical breakthroughs uncovered in the old homesteads of Episode 10. Each of these represented a deliberate choice to push further than the investigation had gone before, to accept real risk in exchange for the possibility of real answers. Hot Pursuit takes that tendency further than any previous episode has, and the result is an encounter that demonstrates both the value of that aggressive approach and the real consequences it can carry. There's a version of this investigation that never takes a helicopter into that airspace. That version produces safer, more controllable operations and avoids the terrifying encounter at the center of this episode. It also never gets as close as this team does to whatever is operating above the triangle, never generates the kind of data that proximity makes possible, and never forces the direct confrontation that this episode ultimately delivers. The choice to push that far, knowing the risk involved, is the choice that defines Hot Pursuit. And whether you see it as reckless or courageous, probably says something about your own relationship with the kind of questions this investigation is trying to answer. What lingers after this episode is not any single piece of data or any specific visual anomaly captured on camera. What lingers is the feeling, communicated through the unfiltered reactions of people who have seen a great deal and are not easily rattled, that whatever is happening above the triangle at Skinwalker Ranch is operating at a level of complexity and intentionality that the investigation's existing frameworks are not fully equipped to account for. That feeling doesn't come from speculation or theory. It comes from direct experience, documented in real time, by a team that went looking for answers and found something considerably more confronting than they anticipated. For longtime viewers, Hot Pursuit is the kind of episode that resets the baseline. After watching it, it's difficult to think about the UAP activity above the triangle in quite the same way as before. The distance that observation from the ground creates, the psychological safety of watching phenomena through a lens from several hundred feet below, is removed entirely when the investigation moves into that airspace directly. What replaces it is something rawer, more immediate, and ultimately more revealing about the nature of what this property is dealing with. That revelation doesn't come neatly packaged with an explanation. It comes the way the most significant discoveries in this investigation tend to come. Unsettling, incomplete, and impossible to set aside. Season 7 has consistently pushed this investigation into territory it hasn't explored before. And Hot Pursuit represents that tendency at its most intense. There's a reason this particular episode carries weight that goes beyond its runtime. When you strip away everything secondary, the sensor data, the camera footage, the post-encounter analysis, what you're left with is a group of trained, experienced investigators who came face to face with something above the triangle that they couldn't categorize, couldn't explain, and couldn't dismiss. That combination of inability to explain and inability to dismiss is the engine that has driven this investigation for 7 seasons. Hot Pursuit puts it front and center, in a way that is more visceral and more immediate than almost anything that has come before it. It's also worth reflecting on what this episode means for the people involved. Investigations like this one carry personal costs that don't always make it onto the screen. The team members who go up in that helicopter and experience what they experience don't simply clock out afterward and move on with their evening. What happens in that airspace above the triangle is the kind of encounter that tends to sit with people, that surfaces unexpectedly and demands to be reconsidered from new angles as more information becomes available. Watching the team in the immediate aftermath of the encounter, you get a sense of that weight settling in. It's not fear exactly, though there is clearly some of that. It's something more complicated. The particular disorientation of having pushed toward an answer and found something that raises more questions than it resolves. That experience of complicated, unsettling discovery is ultimately what Hot Pursuit is about at its deepest level. The helicopter, the pursuit, the encounter, the aftermath. All of it points toward a central truth, that this investigation keeps circling back to no matter how far the methods evolve, or how much evidence gets collected. Skinwalker Ranch is not a passive subject. Whatever is operating here, in the air above the triangle, underground, across the broader geography of the property, it is not indifferent to being studied. This episode makes that point more directly and more uncomfortably than any previous episode has managed to. And it does so not through speculation or theory, but through the direct experience of the people brave enough to take that helicopter into that airspace and see what happened when they got close enough to matter. This is an episode that takes the investigation's most persistent and most dramatic question. What exactly is operating in the airspace above the triangle, and what does it want? And pursues it with a directness that produces results nobody on the team was fully prepared to handle. The encounter they experience in that helicopter above the ranch is going to shape the direction of this investigation for a long time, and the questions it leaves behind are the kind that don't get answered quickly or easily. But they're also exactly the kind of questions that make this investigation worth following. Because they point toward something real, something that demands explanation, and something that Skinwalker Ranch clearly isn't finished revealing. The encounter they experience in that helicopter above the ranch is going to shape the direction of this investigation for a long time, and the questions it leaves behind are the kind that don't get answered quickly or easily. But they're also exactly the kind of questions that make this investigation worth following. Because they point towards something real, something that demands explanation, and something that Skinwalker Ranch clearly isn't finished revealing.